This is Alyssa Bustamante. She committed murder at the age of 15. Her victim was 9-year-old Elizabeth Olten. These girls came from St. Martin's, Missouri, which was described as a super small town and everybody knew everybody. Alyssa's younger sister, who was 6 at the time, went and asked if Elizabeth wanted to go play. The two of them went into the woods as pre-agreed upon between Alyssa and her younger sister. Once Elizabeth was with Alyssa, she began her attack. She slit Elizabeth's throat, stabbed her, and buried her under a pile of leaves. And the grave Elizabeth's body was put in was dug up 5 days earlier by Alyssa. And what would lead to Alyssa confessing was that she made a journal entry right after she committed this murder. And this excerpt right here just gave me damn chills. I strangled them and slit their throat and stabbed them. Now they're dead. I don't know how to feel at the moment. It was amazing. As soon as you get over the, oh my god, I can't do this feeling, it's pretty enjoyable. I'm kind of nervous and shaky though right now. Okay, I gotta go to church now. ... LOL. She was indicted on first-degree murder charges and also charges of armed criminal action due to the murder weapon being a knife. But before trial began, they did a plea deal.
A pair of pink boots waited by the door, the kind a shy 9-year-old slipped on every afternoon before singing Hannah Montana songs or helping her mom in the kitchen. And on this quiet Missouri day, they stayed behind as Elizabeth Olten asked for one small permission that never raised alarms in a town where kids rode bikes and porch lights came on like clockwork. Her mother hesitated for a heartbeat, then said yes, trusting the short walk to a house everyone believed was safe. Just a few doors away lived a teenager with honor roll grades, a church routine, and a smile that made parents feel comfortable leaving their kids in her care. But no one in that neighborhood truly knew what lived beneath the surface. Home, porch light, last message. All the signs of an ordinary evening, yet tucked behind the trees were 2 graves no one had discovered. Elizabeth stepped off the porch and headed toward the girl she trusted, unaware that this small decision would never be reversed. No one knew that would be the last time they saw her walk out the front door. Elizabeth was supposed to be home before the porch light came on, and when the clock slipped past 6 p.m., without the sound of her footsteps on the wooden stairs, her mother felt the first pinch of irritation that rises when a child loses track of time. Yet within minutes that irritation turned into confusion and then into the kind of fear that tightens the chest because a mother knows when something feels off, even if she cannot explain why. She walked outside calling, "Elizabeth, it's time to come home," expecting the familiar shuffle of pink boots or a small voice answering back. But the street stayed quiet while neighbors stepped out onto their porches, glancing around as if trying to place what was different about this evening, and one of them flipped on a porch light early, saying softly, "She's never late. Not this one." Phones buzzed from house to house as parents asked if anyone had seen her, and each answer, "No, not since earlier," tightened the circle around the growing worry until the only thing left was the mother's trembling voice making the first call for help. When the dispatcher asked, "Ma'am, when was the last time you saw her?" The mother's voice cracked as she replied, "She walked down to play. She should have been back by now. This isn't like her." And that sentence hung in the air long enough for the urgency to register with every officer listening. The 911 recording captured her breath, shaking between words. And by 6:30 p.m., cruisers rolled into the subdivision with officers stepping out quickly, flashlights clicking on, and voices calling commands that echoed through the trees while neighbors gathered in clusters, whispering prayers they were afraid to say out loud. Search dogs pulled against their leashes as officers swept the yards, calling Elizabeth's name again and again, and the mother stood, with her hands over her mouth as if holding her heart in place, trying to listen for anything familiar, any sign her child was close. But all she heard was the crumbling of leaves beneath boots and the static of police radios cracking through the night. As deputies spread out, one neighbor approached and said, "She wouldn't run off. She's scared of the dark," a detail that made the officers widen the search in the woods behind the houses, because a 9-year-old terrified of shadows wouldn't choose that direction without guidance, and that realization stiffened the posture of every detective working the scene. Alyssa Bustamante emerged from her home around this time, offering a calm expression that caught the attention of officers because she didn't appear anxious like the others. And when a deputy asked, "Did you see Elizabeth this afternoon?" she responded in a steady, almost flat tone, "She came by, but she left. while her eyes drifted toward the stretch of trees that bordered her backyard. The lack of worry in her voice created a contrast detectives noted immediately, and one officer later recalled in his report, her demeanor didn't match the circumstances, which became part of the early pattern that shaped their instincts that something wasn't aligning the way it should in a missing child case. As the night thickened, officers advanced deeper into the woods, calling her name louder, their flashlights stretching across uneven ground and freshly disturbed soil that didn't fit the natural layout of the forest floor. And when one deputy crouched down to touch the dirt, he noticed how loose it felt beneath his boots, noting out loud, "This was turned over recently." Another officer knelt beside him, running his glove across the ground and saying, "This isn't right. Someone's been digging here." And that comment shifted the tone of the search instantly. The dogs circled the area, pulling harder, their handlers tightening their grip as they waited for instructions, and the mother, standing yards away, felt her knees weaken when an officer glanced in her direction with a look that wasn't reassurance but caution. Neighborhood volunteers tried to comfort her, placing a hand on her shoulder, whispering, "They'll find her. They always do." But even those attempts at encouragement felt thin as the scene became more urgent, more organized, more heavy with each minute that passed without a sound from Elizabeth. Detectives returned to Alyssa again, asking her to come with them and show the last place she saw Elizabeth, and she agreed without hesitation, slipping on a sweatshirt and walking ahead of them with a pace too steady for the fear gripping the rest of the street. A deputy later noted how she pointed them down a trail with her arm extended, yet her eyes shifted in another direction, an inconsistency so subtle most would have missed it. But detectives trained to read behavior caught it instantly, and one leaned toward the other and whispered, "Watch her eyes. She keeps looking over there." They asked her again, "Are you sure this is the way she went?" And she replied, "Yeah, this is where she walked." But her voice held no urgency, no crack, no concern that a child she knew had been missing for hours. As officers turned toward the direction she indicated, one detective paused and tracked the line of her gaze toward a different section of the woods, a place where the trees stood closer together, and the ground looked uneven beneath the fallen leaves, and his instincts told him to mark that spot for a deeper search. The tension rose again as he radioed, "We need another unit behind the Bustamante property." And at that moment, the mother called out her daughter's name again, louder, more strained, more desperate, as the night swallowed her voice without sending anything back. Detectives gathered near the Bustamante home the next morning with the weight of a missing child pressing on every movement. And while interviewing neighbors again, one officer noticed the sleeves of Alyssa's sweatshirt slipping up just enough to reveal sharp, fresh cuts on her arms that hadn't appeared the night before. And when he asked gently, "How'd you get those?" she shrugged and said, "I do it to feel better," in a tone so casual it made the detective pause because it didn't fit the panic surrounding the search. Another detective recorded that her demeanor stayed calm, almost distant, as she leaned against the porch rail, answering questions with short replies, while her grandmother hovered nearby, confused by the sudden focus on her granddaughter. The contradiction grew stronger when they compared her statements from the previous night to her version that morning, noticing that the timeline she offered no longer matched the hours Elizabeth went missing, and when an officer quietly told the lead detective, "She's changing her story," the urgency around her deepened. While they were there, Alyssa walked inside briefly, and investigators used that moment to ask her younger sister again, "Where did Elizabeth go after she came to the house?" And the child answered softly, "Sissy told her to come back later," a detail that conflicted with Alyssa's claim that she had barely seen Elizabeth at all. The detectives exchanged a look that didn't need words, a silent acknowledgement that the pieces weren't fitting, and that they needed to start looking at Alyssa the same way they would look at an adult suspect in a situation where time meant everything. Back at the command post, officers searched Alyssa's MySpace and YouTube activity and found messages that alarmed them, including a post where she had written, "I just want to kill someone before I die," a statement documented by investigators as part of her digital footprint, as well as disturbing sketches and comments that hinted at obsession with control and death rather than teenage rebellion. The behavior pattern grew clearer when detectives realized She had been posting dark messages months before Elizabeth vanished, messages that now held far more weight in the context of a missing 9-year-old. They brought her in for another round of questioning, and during one recorded exchange, an investigator asked, "Did you walk with Elizabeth into the woods?" To which Alyssa replied, "No, I was at home all night." But phone records and witness accounts contradicted her claim. Her relaxed posture, steady voice, and lack of visible fear struck officers as unusual, and one detective later wrote, "Her emotional response did not match the situation." That disconnect between her outward calm and the intensity of the search amplified their suspicions, and the chief instructed the team to go back into the woods with cadaver dogs for one more sweep, focusing especially on the property behind the Bustamante home. The officers prepared themselves for another long day of searching, but the shift in their strategy made it clear they were no longer looking randomly. They were moving with a direction, a pattern, a gut feeling sharpened by everything they had observed. The woods behind Alyssa's house held a heaviness that detectives felt the moment they stepped into the trees, and the dogs began pulling hard toward a section of ground partially covered by fresh leaves, which one of the handlers immediately noted in the report as disturbed and inconsistent with natural forest cover. As officers approached the spot, a deputy knelt down and pressed his hand against the soil and said, "This was dug recently," drawing the attention of the search team because the ground felt loose beneath the top layer. Shovels were brought in quickly, and each scrape pulled away soil that shouldn't have been there, confirming what the dogs had already indicated, that someone had dug purposely and then tried to hide it. When they uncovered the shape of a shallow rectangular pit, one detective stepped back and took a deep breath, rubbing his forehead as the weight of what they were finding settled in, and the chief quietly said, "Everyone hold position," giving the moment the respect it demanded. But when they reached the bottom of that hole and found it empty, the entire team froze, because an empty grave created more fear than a filled one. It meant intention, planning, and something unfinished. The detective who first spotted it whispered, "This wasn't for an animal. This is human-made," and no one disagreed. As they widened the search around the area, the dogs alerted again, this time more intensely, and pulled the handlers toward another patch of ground not far from the first, and when officers brushed away the top layer of leaves, they exposed another section of disturbed soil shaped almost identically to the first. A detective leaned over it and said, "You've got to be kidding me. Another one?" And the chief responded quietly, "Mark it. We dig here next." His voice low and tense because 2 graves changed the direction of an investigation instantly. Officers exchanged looks that carried the gravity of the moment, and several stepped aside to steady themselves as the reality of pre-dug graves for a missing child landed like a punch to the chest. The second grave deepened their dread, because it meant planning long before Elizabeth disappeared, and the discovery forced every assumption about what happened to shift dramatically. Cadaver dogs circled, barking sharply, and their handlers pulled them back as investigators began clearing the area in silence, knowing this was no longer a standard missing child search. It was something far more calculated. And in that stillness, the woods held the kind of quiet that makes every breath feel like it echoes, a quiet detectives would later say they remembered. Years after the case closed, when officers returned to the Bustamante home, the chief asked Alyssa to come to the station, and she agreed without resistance, walking toward the cruiser with the same steady steps she had shown all morning, and an officer standing nearby noted, "She doesn't look scared at all," a detail that stood out because most teens in this situation showed panic or tears. As she sat in the back seat, one detective asked her calmly, "Alyssa, is there anything you want to tell us before we go?" And she looked ahead and said only, "No." The simplicity of her answer unsettled even the most seasoned officers because it lacked the natural fear a teenager should have when a child is missing and graves have been discovered near her home. They drove her in silence to the station as the investigation shifted from a search to a confrontation with truth, and detectives prepared themselves for the conversation they knew could break the case open. The car door closed behind her with a thud that carried the weight of everything they had uncovered in those woods, and the team walked inside, knowing that whatever she said next would rewrite the timeline and reveal the part of the story no one wanted to imagine. Alyssa agreed to go to the station, and what she said there would change this town forever. The interrogation room at the Cole County Sheriff's Department felt colder than usual on the night of October 23, 2009, and the fluorescent lights above hummed softly as Alyssa Bustamante sat at the metal table with a blank expression, her shoulders relaxed in a way that made every detective watching her feel uneasy because it didn't match the urgency of a missing child case that had stretched past 48 hours. Detective David Rice sat across from her and began with calm questions, asking her to walk them through her evening one more time, and each answer she gave sounded flat, rehearsed, and disconnected from the tension outside those walls where officers were preparing for the worst. At one point, he leaned forward and said, "Alyssa, we found something in the woods." And she stiffened just slightly, enough for the team behind the observation glass to lean closer, because it was the first sign of emotion she had shown in hours. When he followed with, "We know you dug the holes. We know they're yours." Her breathing quickened, and the room shifted from routine questioning to the quiet pressure investigators know can break a suspect's walls. The detective placed a photo of the disturbed ground on the metal table and said, "Help us understand what happened." And in that moment, the silence between them began to feel heavier than anything said out loud. When Alyssa finally spoke, her voice trembled for the first time as she whispered, "If I tell you, I'll go to jail forever." And Detective Rice replied gently, "Right now, we just need the truth." A sentence that has appeared in multiple reports describing the tone of the interrogation. She pulled her sweatshirt sleeves over her hands and stared at the table before saying, "I did it. I killed her." And the detective asked softly, "How, Alyssa?" prompting her to slowly reveal the reality that had been buried with the loose soil in the woods. According to the tape statement, she said, "I strangled her, then I cut her, and I stabbed her," speaking in short breaths as detectives wrote down every detail, stunned not just by the confession, but by the calm that followed each sentence. When they asked her why, she looked down and whispered, "I wanted to know what it felt like." A line documented word for word in official court transcripts, and one that would haunt the community long after the case closed. As the confession continued, detectives reported that she spoke with a mixture of fear and detachment, describing how she lured Elizabeth into the woods and attacked her before dragging her to the shallow grave she had dug days earlier. And even the most seasoned officers later admitted her recounting left them shaken because it came from someone so young. During the interrogation, detectives asked her if she understood what she had done, and she nodded slowly as one of them placed her spiral notebook on the table, a diary recovered from her bedroom just hours earlier containing entries that would become some of the most disturbing evidence in the case. In the journal, written in blue ink, she had documented the murder the night it happened, and detectives read her own words back to her. "I just fucking killed someone," followed by, "It was amazing." The words scratched out but still clear enough for investigators to present later in court. When confronted with the entry, Alyssa pressed her hands to her face and whispered, "I didn't mean to write it like that." But detectives noted that she never denied the meaning behind it, and the gravity of her actions settled into the room with a weight that made even the interviewers pause. One detective asked, "Did she say anything to you? Did she cry?" And Alyssa nodded and replied softly, "She said she wanted to go home," a detail pulled directly from her recorded confession, and the officer closed his eyes for a moment before continuing, because that single sentence revealed the human cost of the crime in a way nothing else could. They asked her where Elizabeth was now, and Alyssa told them exactly where she buried her, saying, "Behind my house, in the hole I dug," allowing investigators to move in immediately with cadaver dogs and recovery teams to locate the grave. When news of her confession reached the search volunteers and neighbors who had spent days combing the woods, the emotional impact shattered any illusion that this was a misunderstanding. And adults cried openly as officers confirmed that a young girl everyone trusted had confessed to killing a child they all knew. Elizabeth's family collapsed in grief when authorities notified them, with one officer recalling how her mother fell to her knees and said, "Please tell me she's alive. Please don't tell me she's gone." words repeated in multiple interviews and supported by responders who witnessed the heartbreaking moment. The community that had stood shoulder to shoulder holding flashlights 2 nights earlier now stood in silence, wrestling with the betrayal of learning that the teen they believed was a responsible babysitter had been hiding a violent secret. Neighbors who once waved to her from their driveways now clung to one another, trying to understand how someone raised just a few houses away had committed something so devastating, and the shock spread through the town of St. Martin's like a wave of disbelief. Officers described the emotional whiplash in their reports, saying that the shift from hopeful searching to grim recovery left both professionals and civilians shaken in a way few cases had ever done. Alyssa was taken from the interrogation room in handcuffs shortly after midnight, and though reporters waiting outside expected tears or visible fear from the 15-year-old, she walked out with her head slightly lowered, but no sign of crying, no tremble, no outward panic, creating a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding around her. Prosecutors quickly announced that she would be charged as an adult, citing the severity of the crime and the premeditation demonstrated by the dug graves and diary entry, and the decision sent another shock through the town because it confirmed they were dealing with a case far outside the scope of normal juvenile justice. As officers escorted her to the vehicle, a deputy later stated, "She didn't fight, she didn't cry, she just walked," and another detective added, "It was like she accepted it," describing the unsettling calm that followed her arrest. Reporters asked the sheriff if this case had changed the direction of the investigation, and he answered, "This is no longer a missing child case. This is a homicide," marking the moment the community had feared but had not expected from someone so young. And the prosecutors knew they had only scratched the surface. The chapter closes with Alyssa being placed into the back of a patrol car, the cuffs locked around her wrists, her face expressionless under the harsh glow of the parking lot lights. And the officers watching her realized this was the first time the earlier smile had vanished completely. For the first time, the smile disappears. The courthouse in Jefferson City filled before sunrise on January 30th, 2012, as families from both sides took their seats in a room that felt colder than the winter air outside, and every bench held the weight of a community waiting for answers they feared would break them again. Reporters lined the back wall while deputies stood near the door watching the slow hush settle over the room, a hush broken only when Elizabeth Olten's family walked in, their eyes red but fixed forward because they knew they had to sit through every detail of what happened to their little girl. Alyssa Bustamante entered minutes later, wearing a gray jail-issued outfit, hands cuffed at her waist, and she looked straight ahead with the same blank expression detectives noted throughout the investigation, the same look that unsettled even those who tried to understand her. When she sat down beside her attorneys, a mother in the front row whispered, "How can she be so calm?" And the whisper traveled across the room like a breeze people tried pretending they didn't hear. The judge took his seat and opened the session with a reminder that the evidence presented would be graphic and difficult. A reminder that felt unnecessary to the people who had been grieving since the night Elizabeth disappeared, but necessary for a room filled with adults who still struggled to comprehend a crime committed by a 15-year-old. Prosecutor Mark Richardson began by laying out the planning behind the murder, and he told the court, this was not a moment of impulse. This was preparation, as he held up photos of the 2 graves Alyssa had dug behind her home days before Elizabeth vanished. He explained the premeditation with a voice steady enough to show professionalism, but soft enough to acknowledge the child at the center of the tragedy, and each word added another layer of understanding to the timeline that investigators had pieced together. When the prosecutor read from Alyssa's diary, the same entry that said, "I just fucking killed someone," followed by, "It was amazing," the courtroom shifted in one slow, collective wince, because hearing the words from her own handwriting made the events feel unbearably real. A juror who later spoke to a local station said the room went silent in a way you never forget, especially when the prosecutor described the moment Alyssa admitted she strangled, stabbed, and cut the child before burying her. Richardson continued by showing segments from her recorded confession, including the moment she said, "I wanted to know what it felt like." And parents in the courtroom pulled their children's photos closer to their chest because that single sentence told them more about the motive than anything an expert might have offered. When the defense rose, attorney Don Catlett spoke about Alyssa's childhood, marked by instability, addiction, and abandonment, describing a young girl who had attempted suicide repeatedly and had been placed on antidepressant medications that were being adjusted in the months leading up to the murder. Adjustments, he argued, had affected her emotional reasoning. He said, "This is a child who was failed long before this happened." And although his words were factual and supported by medical records, they offered little relief to the parents sitting feet away who had buried their 9-year-old daughter. The defense presented her psychiatric evaluations, describing depression, self-harm, and emotional trauma rooted in years of chaos. And one expert testified that she exhibited signs of deep psychological distress that predated the crime. But the prosecutor countered by reminding the court that emotional suffering does not erase deliberate planning, and he said, "Her pain cannot excuse what she did to Elizabeth." A line delivered with the kind of clarity that resonated with the families in the room. Alyssa sat quietly through every word, her face still, her hands folded, and her eyes drifting toward the floor as if avoiding the weight of the evidence presented. When it was time for Elizabeth Olten's mother to speak, the courtroom braced itself because everyone understood this would be the moment when emotion replaced evidence, and nothing could have prepared them for the trembling in her voice as she walked to the podium. She clutched a photo of her daughter and said, "You stole everything from her. Everything she could have been," her voice shaking so fiercely that even the deputies near the door looked down, unable to hold her gaze. She told the court how Elizabeth was afraid of the dark, how she still hears her daughter's voice in her sleep, and how she prayed her child did not die alone in the woods, a statement that caused several people behind her to cry quietly into their hands. When she finally said, "Why? Why did you do this to my baby?" The question felt heavy enough to still the entire room, because it was the question everyone had been asking since October 21st, 2009, and Alyssa showed no visible reaction as she looked straight ahead. A reporter later wrote that the mother's words cut through the courtroom like glass, and that description mirrored what many felt as they watched a grieving parent try to find her voice in the aftermath of a loss no sentence could mend. Alyssa remained emotionless throughout the hearing, the same steady posture she had shown during interrogations, and her lack of outward remorse only deepened the divide between the facts presented and the humanity expected of someone who had confessed to such a violent act. Prosecutor Richardson paused before continuing his statement and said, "The community trusted her," emphasizing how deeply the betrayal had settled into every corner of the neighborhood where Alyssa once helped babysit younger children. He reminded the court that this crime had not only taken a life, but also shaken the foundation of trust that held families together, and his tone carried the weight of a town forever changed. At this point, the judge watched Alyssa closely, observing the quiet way she sat, and although she moved occasionally, shifting her shoulders, fixing her sleeves, her face stayed unchanged, emotionless in a setting where grief sat openly on every bench. But the judge had been watching her closely. When Judge Pat Joyce delivered the sentence, the room held its breath, and she spoke slowly, saying, "The court finds that the actions committed were intentional, violent, and irreversible," and her voice never wavered as she imposed life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. She then added the consecutive 30-year sentence for armed criminal action, and the combined punishment drew a gasp from a few people who had expected a lesser sentence due to Alyssa's age. But the judge made it clear that the severity of the crime demanded accountability beyond juvenile measures. As the words settled into the room, witnesses said they saw Alyssa's face change for the first time, the blank expression faltering as she looked toward the floor with a sudden strain in her jaw that had not appeared at any point during the trial. One detective later said, "That's when it hit her," describing the shift in her posture as the reality of her future finally broke through whatever detachment she had hidden behind for years. Deputies moved toward her to escort her out, and for the first time since the investigation began, she looked less like the calm teen who once stood on her porch and more like someone who realized there was no path back. He faced the court, but she faced forever. In the weeks following the sentencing, the neighborhood that once echoed with children's laughter became a place where quiet moments carried more weight than conversation. and families gathered for candlelight vigils that filled the cool Missouri evenings with a gentle glow that stretched down the sidewalks like a chain of shared grief. Pink ribbons were tied to tree trunks in long, unbroken lines that led from the Olton home to the wooded trail where Elizabeth spent her last moments, and each ribbon held a handwritten message from neighbors who had watched her grow up and now struggled to accept that she would never skip across their yards again. Posters covered the community board outside the local church, filled with notes written by classmates in uneven handwriting saying things like, "We miss you, Elizabeth," and "You didn't deserve this." Messages that felt raw and sincere because they came from children trying to make sense of a world that had taken one of their own. Volunteers placed a cheer uniform at the memorial site, a small white and pink outfit Elizabeth loved because it made her feel like the older girls she admired, and seeing it beside the candles and photographs made the loss feel even sharper for those who remembered how bright her smile had been whenever she talked about joining the team one day. Parents stood with their arms wrapped around their children longer than usual, whispering reminders not to walk alone or wander too far, and the fear that settled across the neighborhood replaced the ease that once defined their days. Inside the Olton home, her mother kept Elizabeth's room exactly the way it had looked on the morning she left, with the bed neatly made beneath the polka-dot comforter she loved, and her favorite stuffed bear sitting by the pillow as though waiting for her return. And even months later, the family couldn't bring themselves to move a single item because touching anything felt like erasing a piece of her. Her last school paper still sat on the desk, a science worksheet with her careful handwriting filling the lines, and her mother often stood in the doorway at night staring at it, whispering, "I'll never get another one from her." A line she shared during interviews as a reminder of how quickly ordinary moments turn into memories that cling painfully to the heart. Her younger siblings asked why they couldn't play in her room anymore, and the family answered in soft voices because explaining the permanence of loss to children who still believed in happy endings felt almost impossible. Holidays were quieter that year, and neighbors who used to fill the street with decorations decided to scale back, feeling that anything too bright or cheerful would clash with the grief still lingering in the air. The Olton family received letters from around the country, strangers sending sympathy, prayers, and reminders that Elizabeth's story had touched people far beyond their small Missouri town, and the kindness helped, but it did not ease the ache left in every room she once walked through. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away inside the Women's Eastern Reception, Diagnostic and Correctional Center, Alyssa Bustamante began the first months of her life sentence, and officers noted in intake reports that she showed a subdued demeanor. No laughter, no smirks, none of the bravado that once marked her early interrogations. Inmates who encountered her described her as quiet, withdrawn, often keeping to herself during mealtimes, and according to one correctional officer, she didn't talk much. She just followed instructions, a stark contrast to the girl whose diary once expressed excitement over taking a life. Mental health evaluations continued throughout her early incarceration, with clinicians documenting depression and emotional detachment, conditions consistent with her previous history, but now shaped by the reality that she would spend decades behind bars before seeing daylight as a free person again. Her grandmother visited only a few times during the first year, and according to publicly recorded statements, Alyssa apologized to her during one visit, saying, "I'm sorry for everything," though her emotional tone was difficult for even her own family to interpret. She attended mandatory counseling and educational programs, but reports from prison staff indicated that she remained largely isolated in demeanor, no longer showing the confidence or control she once displayed, and her presence in the facility became another reminder of how a single violent act had altered countless lives. For a girl who once believed herself untouchable, the thin mattress, locked doors, and strict routines of prison life stripped away any illusion of control she might have had. Back in St. Martin's, the conversations that unfolded in living rooms, grocery stores, school parking lots, and church basements carried the same uneasy undertone, and neighbors found themselves circling around two difficult questions that lingered long after the trial ended. One question was spoken in hushed voices by parents sitting on porches late in the evening. Can evil come from a child? And they asked it not to cast judgment, but to grapple with the fear that someone so young, so familiar, and so close could commit something so violent without warning signs obvious enough to prevent it. The second question was one that weighed heavily on teachers, counselors, and community leaders. Could anyone have seen this coming? And though mental health experts offered explanations about trauma, depression, and self-harm, the truth remained tangled between what was visible and what had been hidden behind Alyssa's carefully maintained outward behavior. Some parents admitted they replayed old memories, trying to decide whether they had ever noticed something out of place in her smile or her posture, and others wondered whether any amount of awareness could stop a child intent on harm when that intent had been planned so quietly. Community meetings discussed youth mental health, supervision, and the boundaries between privacy and protection. Yet the answers rarely resolved the emotional conflict in the room because the case had moved beyond policy. It had become a wound that reshaped how families understood trust. In that sense, the legacy of Elizabeth's story became more than a tragedy. It became a mirror that forced an entire town to examine itself, its children, and the hidden corners of human behavior. The story closes gently, not with resolution, but with reflection that settles into the spaces silence usually fills. Because after every light at the vigil flickers out and every courtroom door closes, what remains are the memories carried by those who loved Elizabeth and the questions that echo whenever a parent watches their child walk toward a friend's house. Her name is written on ribbons, whispered in prayers, carried in the hearts of classmates who grew older while she stayed 9 forever, and her presence lingers in the rooms where she once laughed, played, and dreamed. And across the state, Alyssa wakes each morning to a life defined by steel doors and strict schedules, living out the consequence of a choice she could never take back, a choice that changed the course of countless lives, including her own. The town moves forward because it must, but it never forgets the weight of the lesson left behind, a reminder that even in the safest neighborhoods, light and darkness sometimes sit closer than anyone wants to believe. The loss remains, the memory lives on, and the question at the heart of this story continues to echo through Missouri homes during quiet evenings. How do you heal from something that never should have happened? Her story isn't a headline. It's a reminder that behind every smile is a life we may never understand, and behind every silence, a child waiting to be protected. If this story moved you, share her name, because memory is its own form of justice.